Okay, so welcome back from the break. Let's take a look at this second last concept check question so we can look at the last section. It is likely that Hox genes have played a major role in the evolution of novel morphological forms. Why? Well, remember that Hox genes control the basic body plan or the layout of the body plan. And because Hox genes are master control genes, they control not individual genes, they control whole families of genes. When you change the expression of a single Hox gene, you change the expression of all of those genes as well. And so whenever a Hox gene undergoes a mutation that changes the timing of its expression or the location of its expression or the group of genes that it is responsible for controlling, you're going to see a major change in the morphology. And so what appears to be at face value, something that is insignificant, a change in a single gene and its expression can have huge consequences, huge knock-on consequences, because knocking down that single domino results in the knocking down of multiple dominoes, which has a huge effect or can potentially have a huge effect in the overall body plan, major changes in morphology. So that's why Hox genes have almost certainly been at the heart of major morphological changes, not gross changes in lots of genes, but small changes in one gene that has a huge knock-on because it controls or it influences the expression of hundreds of other genes that are under its control. So let's take a quick look at this last section and then we'll finish up this chapter. So one of the things that you could unfortunately get the impression is that there is a goal to evolution, because when you look at phylogenetic trees, you can pretty much draw a line from an ancestor to an extant species, a living species. And you might be tempted to say, well, there was a goal here, that the drive from that ancestor towards the extant species was what gave rise to the extant species. But nothing could be further from the truth. Evolution is not goal-driven or goal-oriented. Evolution, natural selection, is simply tinkering or modifying existing structures, and whatever works, works, and whatever doesn't, doesn't. And so for organisms that have features that work, they're successful as a result of the tinkering. But organisms that have features that are not successful or not favored, well, they become extinct because the tinkering that led to their changes does not lead to their success. It leads to their failure. So all evolution can do is modify what exists. It rarely, if ever, comes up with something that is brand new. It's all about modifying what exists. And if that modification works, the organism is successful. If the modification doesn't work, then the organism is ultimately unsuccessful and becomes extinct very quickly and doesn't leave behind descendants. And remember, part of the measure of success of an organism or a group of organisms is how many subsequent ancestral descendant species or descendant organisms it leaves behind. And we can think in terms of natural selection working on individual populations, but we can also think in terms of evolution and natural selection working on groups of organisms. Groups of organisms can be successful if they leave behind many descendant species, and be less successful if they don't leave behind any descendant species. This is a relatively new concept within evolutionary theory. The idea that natural selection can not only influence the course of the evolution of a single species and lead to the success or failure of a single species, but it could also lead to the success or failure of a group of species. So a highly successful group of species could be something like the dinosaurs. You start with a few ancestral species, but because they have features that are highly favored by the environmental changes, it gives rise to a whole lot of descendant species. They're extremely successful. And within the dinosaurs, you have the tyrannosaurs, you have the ceratopsians, you have the hadrosaurs. Each of those are represented in fossil record in a great diversity because they had features that were themselves very favorable and led to a lot of descendant species. It's all about the tinkering and features that are successful versus features that are not. But ultimately, of course, we know that all species will eventually fail at some point because they cannot adapt. So in terms of something that is novel, something that is I'm trying to think of the right term here. Something that has a great deal of complexity that doesn't seem to be explainable in terms of all of the pieces evolving at one time to give rise to what is quite arguably a very, very complex feature. Can be explained in terms of evolution. What we need to bear in mind is that for a feature of great complexity to appear, you don't necessarily need to have all the pieces evolve at one time in order for that complex piece of or complex feature to evolve. And this is one of the great misunderstandings that has been propagated about evolution, that evolution simply cannot be true because you can't explain the evolution of a complex feature by having all the pieces evolve all at once. And the eye has been the great example, because if you look at a mammalian eye, it is truly complex. It has a light detecting membrane, we call it the retina at the back of the eye. You have a flexible lens controlled by muscles that change its curvature to change the bending of the light. You have a fluid-filled sac between the lens and the retina to further help in the bending of the light to form the image on the back of the retina. You have a bundle of nerves called the optic nerve that transmits the nerve signals to the brain where they are interpreted, and the actual images that we see are formed as a consequence of those nerve signals that come from the retina. And you might imagine that having all of those pieces evolve at once would be very, very improbable. The probability of that happening would be very, very small. But it loses sight of the fact that if evolution starts with a basic structure and tinkers with it and changes its form, anything that leads to something that is useful and is better adapted to a process is likely to survive. All it needs to do is be beneficial to the organism that possesses it. And in terms of a complex eye, that's basically what happened. And we see it played out in mollusks. So within mollusks are all the necessary intermediate stages to go from a simple light detecting organ to an eye that is every bit as complex as our own. And as I'll show you towards the end of the discussion of this diagram, a cephalopod eye, that of an octopus or a squid, is actually a better eye than ours. It has a better design than our own eye. And one of the things that you really need to know is that eyes are relatively simple to develop. And evolutionarily, pretty simple to construct, apparently, because such a wide range of organisms possess eyes. So there's the mammalian eye. So it doesn't matter where in mammals you look. The mammalian eye is pretty similar across the board. That's why if you do an anatomy class, you won't dissect necessarily a human eye, you'll dissect an eye from another animal, cows or something like that, because mammal eyes are all the same. But as I'll show, while the cephalopod eye looks very similar to ours, it is in fact has some advantages that ours don't have, and is in many ways a better design than ours, but that's because it evolved independently. Mammals and mollusks shared a common ancestor way back, probably in the Ediacaran or even before then, would be the last time that we would share a common ancestor. So the evolution of an eye in mollusks versus the evolution of an eye in humans or in mammals followed very different evolutionary pathways, but converged on a similar design for a similar purpose. And in some senses, as I said, the cephalopod design is better than ours. Then insects have eyes. So arthropods are a different group of animals again. Surprisingly, cnidarians have eyes. And there specifically, I'm thinking in terms of box jellyfish and the like, the cubozoans. They have eyes that allow them to function as very effective predators and chase their prey. And if you ever want to see a really interesting video, look up a little cnidarian by the name of Irukandji, Irukajni. Irukan, Kanji, sorry. If you look that up, and you'll come across this tiny little cnidarian. It's a member of the box jellyfish, the cubozoans. Its bell is about the size of the tip of your little finger. But it has some very, very potent venom in its tentacles. It kills humans. The venom is so toxic. And it kills within 30 minutes to 45 minutes. It's very, very potent. And even a slight brush can leave behind huge necrotic scars and cause weeks of intense pain for which there is no solution. And it's truly life-changing. People who have had even slight contacts with these guys have had to spend a life with migraines and so forth. And they have eyes that are every bit as good as ours in terms of identifying prey animals. And in the particular video that I'm thinking of, a researcher that was investigating them captured some of these and put them into a swimming pool, an above ground swimming pool filled with salt water. Got into the pool with them, and they sensed the presence of the guy and chased him around the swimming pool because they could see him. So eyes, and really well-developed functional eyes, are relatively simple, evolutionarily at least, to produce. So what have we got here? Well, in some mollusks, like limpets, the only requirement is to detect the presence of light or shade. If there's light present, the assumption is there are no predators. In the presence of shadow, could be a potential predator, so the limpet simply sucks itself down onto the rocks and holds on very tightly with its muscular foot. And so all it needs is a layer of light detecting cells that can detect the presence or absence of light. And so that's what they have. If you want to be a little bit more informed, then direction of light would be a useful thing to have. So now the layer of cells is curved. So if light is coming from this side of the cup gets light, the other side doesn't. So now you have directional information. You know which direction the light is coming from. And so mollusks with this cup-shaped light detecting device have a little bit more information because they can tell the direction the light is coming from or the direction the shadow could be coming from. So they are better informed, and this is of benefit to them. If you want to actually form images, so if you're a predator, it would be nice to be able to see images of the prey so you can chase them. So the nautilus, which is a relative of the octopus and squid, it's a cephalopod, but it's a shelled cephalopod, and it's a deep water animal. So it's not going to be able to collect a huge amount of light, but in order to be able to form simple images, it has what is called a pinhole camera. So the light now passes through this small hole and forms an image on the back of the eye. So the light passes through the hole and forms an image on the back of the eye in the retina, on what we would call the retina. You can actually make an example of this from a shoebox. If you take a shoebox and cut out the small end of the box, put in some tissue paper and poke a hole in it with a pin, so you literally have a pinhole in there. If you point the pinhole towards the sun, you'll see an image of the sun on the inside of the back of the box, and you'll be able to see the sunspots, and on the edge of the sun, you can see the huge mass ejections. It's a really good way to actually look at a solar eclipse without wearing the welder's glasses or damaging your eyes by looking at the sun. You can look at the image of the solar eclipse on the back of the box. It's a really useful tool. And so the nautilus has these pinhole type eyes that allows them to see images and chase their prey. Now, if you want to form sharper images, a lens would be beneficial because now you can specifically bend the light to form the image. But if the lens is inflexible, it limits the range of distances over which you're going to get sharp images, but nonetheless, you can get sharper images because you've got a lens now bending the light in a specific fashion to form the image on the back of the eye on the retina. So the murexes have an eye like this, and so they can see more sharply defined images because they've got a lens. But the real system that gives you the best images is to be able to flex the lens, but that requires muscles. And so in squid and octopi, the lens material is now flexible. It has muscles attached to it that can stretch or relax, or contract and relax, and therefore stretch or relax the lens and change its curvature, which changes the bending of the light and therefore allows it to form sharp images over a wider range of distances, which is perfect for an animal that is highly mobile and a very aggressive predator. And so again, the lens being flexible and being stretchable allows for a wider range of curvature and therefore a wider range of distances over which you can find images. So how does a squid have an advantage over us, or an octopus over us in the shape of the eye? Well, a couple of quick diagrams. If this is the retina of a squid eye or an octopus eye, the blood vessels and the optic nerve that connect the brain to the retina and supply oxygen and nutrients to the retina connects behind the layer of cells that form the retina. And so there's nothing between the light or of the lens from where the light is passing through and the retina. And so you get the full amount of light that's coming through the lens falling on the retina with no interference. In the case of the human eye, so let me bring in the eraser. In the case of a human eye, again, we've got the retina, but now the nerve cord and the blood vessels pass through the retina and attach to the surface of the retina. So they're not attached behind, they're attached in front. And that means they are now sitting between the lens and the retina. And so on the back of your eye, and we all have this, and you can figure out where it is because you can map your retina. And I remember in the past when I was really young, when I was in college, taking an anatomy class and mapping out the location of my blind spot, because we all have a blind spot, and that blind spot is where the optic nerve penetrates through the retina, so that to bring the nerves to the surface of the retina, and they spread out from there to connect to the cells. And so that's actually a real disadvantage. It takes away from the visual acuity of our eye. It's a less useful design than the design of the squid. So wrap your head around that one for a moment. Not only do they have an eye similar to ours and functionally equivalent to ours, it's actually in many ways a better design, because the optic nerve and the blood vessels that supply the retina don't interfere with the ability of the retina to capture light energy. Our eye actually has a design that takes away from its ability, because part of the retina is disrupted by the presence of the optic nerve passing through to connect to the cells on the surface. Not as good a design, but that's because the two eyes developed independently along different evolutionary pathways, but arrived at a similar solution to the same problem, trying to produce sharp images over multiple distances. And so you arrive at a similar sort of design, but the cephalopod design is in many ways superior to ours because of the interaction between the optic nerve and the blood vessels and the retina. But therein is part of this idea that I'm discussing, that evolution does not have goals and does not negate the evolution of complex structures, because all we need to do is to have intermediates that evolution can tinker with and form that lead to more complex structures, so long as the intermediates are beneficial to the organisms that possesses them. Because in the end, remember, it comes down to the cost-benefit analysis. And so long as the benefit outweighs the cost, creating more complexity is not an issue. So long as the increasing complexity is of benefit, leads to greater benefit. And so the increasing complexity of the light sensing devices here in the mollusks is of great benefit to the organisms that possesses them, and allows evolution to continue tinkering and creating greater complexity until you wind up with the squid/octopus eye. So what we need to be careful of is trying to demonstrate trends in evolution that don't exist. But it's very tempting to do this. So here is the modern horse, Equus. And Equus is the genus for the horse. And this is actually a drawing of Przewalski's horse, which is considered to be the source of all modern horses. They're all descended from Przewalski's horse, or at least something like Przewalski's horse. They are unfortunately threatened. They were once considered to be extinct in the wild. but they have been reintroduced into the wild, and there are some small herds in the wild again in Siberia, but you can find them in zoos as well. And so this is Przewalski's horse, and we can draw a line back through the family tree of modern horses all the way back to Hyracotherium, which is considered to be the ancient ancestor of the modern horse. This is a dog-like or dog-sized creature. It was a browser, meaning it ate leaves and it lived in forested regions, and it was likely preyed upon by those terror birds that I mentioned previously. The large flightless predatory birds that dominated the landscape for about 10 million years after the end Cretaceous extinction. And they were the top predators for that period of time until mammals started to diversify, and the terror birds then were pushed to extinction because they couldn't escape from the predatory mammals that were raiding their nests and stopping them from reproducing, because they were ground reproducers, strictly ground dwelling. So that the Hyracotherium, we believe, was probably preyed on by those terror birds. They coexisted at the same time. And you'll notice that there were browsing descendants for a long period of time until you see a transition to grazing. And then the modern horse is a grazer. It feeds on grass. That's the grazing behavior versus the browsing behavior. If this was the line that you drew, and you thought that this was the trend in evolution to go from browsing to grazing, and that's the reason why modern horses exist, you would lose sight of two very important ideas. There were a large number of related species, you can see them all here, that were also grazers, and in their time they were extremely successful. And there's no reason why they could not have given rise to modern descendants if grazing had been favored. But browsing had been favored. But it turns out that browsing would eventually not be favored, because the large forested areas would give way to large grassy plains over time. And the browsing species would be at a distinct disadvantage, because they would need to be able to, number one, feed on grass, and number two, living on the plains out in the open, be able to move very quickly to escape from predators. And most of the browsers were short-legged and therefore could not run very fast. So out on a grassy plain, they would be at a distinct disadvantage. But the descendants of some of the browsers were evolving longer legs. And so when the forests started to be displaced by grasslands, they were at an advantage because they could escape from grazers, from predators. And as runners, they started to evolve a single-toed leg, because that's more efficient as a runner on a grassy plain. And so you see the evolution of a species that is losing the multi-toed foot in favor of a single-toed foot, but also developing longer legs, advantages on a grassy plain. And they're transitioning not only to being a runner, but also a grazer. And so as the grasslands evolve, the long-legged grass-eating descendants of this large body of grazers, of browsing species, have an advantage, because they had adaptations that favored grazing versus all the other species that favored browsing. So it's not that the goal or the trend or the direction was in favor of grazing and long legs. It's that at the time that these features started to evolve, and you can see that even here in Mesohippus, there is a trend towards longer legs, even as a browser, and the development of longer toes. That's not the trend. These were just the species that happened to have the features that were favored at this point in time. Right place, right time. Wrong place, wrong time. That's what we need to bear in mind. So even though it is possible to suggest that there are goals or trends or directions in evolution, we should never lose sight of the fact that those trends are not what they appear to be. Those goals are not what they appear to be. Those directions are not what they appear to be. They are artificial, only because we can look back in time and see that possibility. But we have to look at the big picture and realize that there were a lot of other things going on in parallel, a lot of other species that existed in parallel that might have been successful and over time, and were certainly successful in their time. And you can't lose sight of that. It's just that they failed to adapt or failed to have features that allowed them to adapt when conditions changed, and they lost out. Not because they were wrong. They were certainly right at their time, but they were wrong in terms of the changes. And so when we look at our own evolution, and we will when we get towards the end of chapter 34, that is one of the things that makes understanding why humans, Homo sapiens, are the only extant member of genus Homo today. Is it possible that other members of genus Homo could have been equally successful as ourselves? Well, if conditions had been different, quite possibly. We happen to have the adaptations that allowed us to take advantage of the changes in climate over time that other members of genus Homo could not. So genetically speaking, Neanderthals are not that significantly different from ourselves. But they were superbly adapted to cold environments, and that's why they thrived during the last ice age. But when conditions changed, they were no longer adapted to those changing conditions. And eventually they would become extinct, either because of those changing conditions, or because they couldn't compete against early Homo sapiens. We don't know which, but both ideas have been proposed. But nonetheless, if conditions had not changed, we may have been the ones that didn't succeed, and Neanderthals may have been the species that succeeded. It's all about having the right adaptations at the time that the changes are occurring. So it's all about tinkering and all about which changes as a result of that tinkering are successful at that time. So, last concept check question, because we are at the end of the chapter. So how can descent with modification explain the evolution of complex structures? Well, again, that's the story of the eye in the mollusks. It's the story of any complex structure, no matter where it's found. It is not necessary for all the necessary components of a complex structure to evolve at the same time and be present at the same time. Statistically, the chance of that happening is very, very small. But that doesn't say that complex structures can't evolve, because we see complex structures in all sorts of organisms. Complexity or increasing complexity is always possible in evolution, so long as the intermediates from the simple to the complex pass the cost-benefit analysis, that they provide a greater benefit than the cost of that increased complexity. So long as the increased complexity, so long as the more complex structures that are the product of the tinkering provide a greater benefit to the organism that possesses them, there is always a possibility of increased complexity. Complexity and the evolution of complex structures does not run counter to the second law of thermodynamics. It is not statistically impossible for a complex structure to evolve. Those arguments are simply proposed because of a misunderstanding of the nature of evolution. Complexity, in increasing complexity, is always possible so long as there is, number one, an excess of energy to drive the process, which there is, and a benefit to be gained by a more complex structure, which is not necessarily always the case, but in the examples that I've talked about, that I hope you understand, you have seen that each of the more complex structures that we see in the mollusks that lead towards the squid eye are beneficial to the organisms that possess them. So that's it. That's chapter 25, and it looks like Zoom has behaved itself. So we've got a complete set of recordings now. So again, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments about anything that I've talked about in this series of recordings, please let me know either by email or come to Office House, and let's clear up any concerns that you might have. Otherwise, I'll see you back here for the next chapter, chapter 26, which is, let me just check for a moment because I forgot what chapter 26 is all about. Let's clarify that. Chapter 26, which is all about phylogeny and cladistic analysis. That's a really cool topic because it helps you understand a little bit more about the nature of evolution and natural selection, but it also helps you understand why we draw the phylogenetic trees and on what basis. So more of that in the next chapter. I'll see you then.